The cold came before the light. It always did at Firebase Kestrel. The darkness would still be absolute, the stars hard and indifferent above the Hindu Kush, and the cold would arrive first like a scout sent ahead of the day to remind everyone on that narrow shelf of rock and frozen earth exactly where they were and exactly how little the mountain cared about their presence. Nora Callahan had been waking before the cold for 41 days. She was already dressed when the temperature dropped its sharpest degree, already lacing her boots by the time the wind began its first run down off the ridge. She moved through the pre-dawn darkness of the firebase with the particular economy of someone who has done the same thing so many times that the body no longer requires the mind's instruction. Left out of the medical bay, straight across the open ground, right along the inner wall where the shadow was deepest, up through the gap in the rock formation that the morning patrol used as a landmark and that no one else seemed to have noticed offered a secondary route to the high ground above the gate. She had mapped that route on day 3. The position she had chosen was a shallow depression in the rock face, approximately 40 feet above the firebase's northern perimeter. It was not comfortable. The stone held the cold of the night long past the point where the air began to warm, and the wind that funneled through the gap to her left had a particular quality in the early morning, a focused edge that found the space between her collar and her jaw with unerring accuracy. She had learned to angle her face slightly right to redirect the worst of it. She settled into prone without thinking about settling into prone. Her elbows found the familiar depressions in the rock where 40 mornings of pressure had smoothed the surface incrementally. Her hips dropped to the angle that distributed her weight across the stone most efficiently. Her right hand closed around nothing, the practiced grip of a person reaching for something that was not there, something she had not been permitted to bring to this position. Something that existed only in the calculation. She ran every morning in the space between observation and record, 840 meters. She looked across that distance without a scope, using only her eyes and the knowledge of what her eyes were seeing. The ridge on the far side of the valley was a dark mass against a sky just beginning to consider lightning. She had learned its contours the way her grandfather had taught her to learn terrain, not by looking at it once and deciding she understood it, but by looking at it every single day, at every light condition, until the shape of it lived in her, the way a familiar face lives in you, instantly recognizable in any weather, at any distance, in any degree of darkness. She found the tooth without searching for it. It jutted from the upper ridgeline like a broken molar, a formation of darker rock against the surrounding stone angled slightly west, offering what she had calculated to be an almost perfect sightline down onto the patrol road at its most exposed section. The stretch of open ground near the valley floor, where the route passed through a natural funnel between two rock formations before climbing back up toward the firebase. A skilled marksman positioned at the tooth would have a clear shot at that funnel, at approximately 840 meters. She opened the third notebook. She kept 3 notebooks simultaneously at Firebase Kestrel, and each one represented a category of attention that the people around her had decided she was not qualified to exercise. The first was her medical log, official and impeccable, the procedural documentation that was her sanctioned purpose on this firebase. She maintained it with a precision that no one questioned, because no one thought to question it, because a bandage girl keeping careful medical records was exactly what a bandage girl was supposed to do. The second notebook was less official. It contained terrain observations, elevation changes, rock formations, natural choke points, the way shadow moved across the valley at different hours, the positions that offered cover versus the positions that offered only the illusion of cover. She had been building a picture of this ground for 41 days. The third notebook was the one she opened now. Wind data. Every morning at this hour, every evening before last light for 41 consecutive days. Direction, estimated velocity, the thermal patterns off the southern slope, the way the air funneled through the gap to her left, and what that meant for trajectory at distance. The way the wind died for approximately 11 minutes around 6:40 most mornings before picking back up with a slight shift in direction. She recorded the morning reading. Northwest, approximately 7 miles per hour, light variable. The thermal off the eastern rock face was doing what it did most mornings at this hour, creating a subtle counterpressure at elevation that a shooter would need to account for. Most shooters would not account for it because most shooters relied on the wind they could feel at their position, rather than the wind that existed in the full column of air between themselves and their target. Her grandfather had taught her that the wind at your position is the least important wind. She wrote it down and closed the notebook and lay still for a moment in the early morning dark, looking at the place where the tooth disappeared into the ridge, thinking about what she had seen 12 days ago and what she had done with what she had seen and what had been done with what she had done. Then she got up and went back down to the Firebase, and she went to work. Senior Chief Dale Rourke arrived at the medical bay at 07:15 without knocking. He never knocked. Nora had observed this about him over 41 days with the same careful attention she gave the wind. He entered every space in the Firebase as though the concept of announcement did not apply to a man of his particular gravity, as though doors existed for other people, and he moved through them only as a courtesy to the doors themselves. He was 43 years old and built like someone had taken 17 years of operational service and compressed it into a single physical object. Not large exactly, but dense in the way that certain kinds of experience make a person dense, as though the years had pressed themselves into his frame and made him heavier than his dimensions suggested. He had a chest full of decorations he never talked about and a management philosophy that could be summarized in 4 words: he already knew everything. He believed this completely. Nora was changing the dressing on Griffith Doyle's shoulder when Rourke came in. Doyle was sitting on the exam table with his shirt off and his jaw set in the expression of a man who was tolerating the process with the specific dignity of someone who considered medical attention a necessary inconvenience. The rotator cuff strain was 4 days old. She had told Rourke on day 1 that Doyle needed 4 to 6 days of limited load-bearing. Rourke had noted this recommendation and moved on, which was his way of indicating that he had heard her and would continue to operate according to his own judgment. Doyle was scheduled for the Thursday patrol. Rourke crossed the room without looking at her, picked up the medical status report she had left on the counter for the morning brief, scanned it for approximately 3 seconds, and dropped it on the floor. Not on the counter, not on the exam table, on the floor. Nora did not stop what she was doing, because she could not stop what she was doing. Her right hand was pressing a clean dressing against Doyle's shoulder, and if she released the pressure, the wound would begin seeping again and Doyle would sit there bleeding while she picked up a piece of paper. She kept her hands exactly where they were and looked at Rourke. He was already looking at her. "You are a bandage girl," he said. He said it loud. He said it in the register of a man who is not having a private conversation, but making a public statement, his voice carrying through the open door of the medical bay into the compound beyond, where 3 men were moving through the morning routine and 2 more were visible through the window. He said it with the comfortable authority of someone announcing a fact that everyone in the vicinity already understood and that required no further examination. "Not a fighter. Stay behind the wire and don't get in the way of people who actually matter out here." Nobody moved, nobody said a word. Doyle looked at the wall. His jaw was still set in the same expression, but there was something new in it now, a rigidity that had less to do with pain and more to do with a man deciding not to look at the thing that was happening in front of him, because looking at it would require him to have a position on it. Rourke picked up the medical status report from the floor. He straightened it. He walked out. Nora finished changing Doyle's dressing. She did it with the same hands she had used before Rourke walked in. The same pressure, the same methodical progression from wound edge to center, the same assessment of tissue response that told her what she needed to know about how the repair was progressing. Her hands did not shake. They had never shaken. Her grandfather had spent years making them reliable, and reliable meant reliable in all conditions, not just the comfortable ones. When she was done, she taped the dressing, checked the tension at the shoulder joint, and told Doyle the same thing she had told him on day 1. 4 to 6 days, no overhead carry above 30 pounds. He said, "Yes, ma'am," in the voice of a man who meant it slightly more than he had the first time she said it. She spent the rest of the morning doing what she always did. She checked on the 2 men recovering from altitude adjustment issues that had been mismanaged in the first week before she arrived. She restocked the trauma kits. She updated the medical log with the morning's assessments, noting Doyle's shoulder progress, noting the altitude cases, noting the 2 men who had come to her in the past week for issues they had not reported through official channels, because reporting through official channels meant sitting through a conversation with Rourke about operational readiness, and the informal channel, the one that led to the Bandage Girl's medical bay at hours when the compound was quiet, had become its own kind of institution. She noted all of it with the precision of someone who understood that records were not just documentation. Records were the only form of truth that survived past the moment of its occurrence. At noon, she sat outside on the south-facing rock shelf that caught the best of the midday sun, which at 9,000 feet in the Hindu Kush was a resource to be taken seriously, and she ate her lunch and she watched the valley. Jonah Merritt appeared from her left without announcing himself and sat down on the rock 2 feet away from her. He was 26 years old and had been a member of the team for 2 years, which meant he was experienced enough to know that he didn't know everything, and young enough that this knowledge still made him uncomfortable sometimes. He had a quality of attention that Nora had noticed on day 3, the same day she had found the secondary route to the high position above the gate. He watched things, not in the anxious way of someone expecting threat, but in the patient way of someone collecting information they intended to use later. He had been watching her for approximately 5 weeks. She had known for approximately 5 weeks. She had said nothing about it because nothing about it required a response. He had not interfered. He had not offered commentary. He had simply observed with the peripheral attention of someone who understood that the thing they were watching was more complex than their current framework could accommodate. They sat without speaking for a moment. Below them, the valley spread out in the particular afternoon haze that came off the southern slope when the temperature differential reached a certain threshold. She had recorded the conditions that produced this haze in the second notebook under environmental factors because the haze reduced visibility across the valley floor to the point where observation from the Firebase was significantly impaired, and she had noted that the movement she had seen on the far ridgeline appeared specifically during this window. That had been 12 days ago. "How long have you been shooting?" Merritt said. He said it the way he said most things, without preamble, without the social scaffolding that most people use to approach a direct question. Just the question placed in the air between them, available to be answered or not answered as she chose. "Since I was 7, she said. She said it the same way. Not performing, not minimizing, just the fact stated at its actual size. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the valley. A hawk was working the thermal currents above the southern slope, making the long, efficient circles of a creature that understood air the way she understood air. "Your grandfather," he said, "you've mentioned him." She had mentioned him once in passing in a conversation that had lasted 4 minutes, and that she had not expected him to retain. "He trained me," she said. "He was a Marine. Scout Sniper Gulf War. After he came home, he bought land outside of Tucson and spent 30 years building a range and teaching people who wanted to learn. He said the discipline was its own purpose, that you don't maintain the skill for a specific moment. You maintain it because the person who maintains it is a different kind of person than the person who doesn't." Merritt turned and looked at her. "What's your actual range?" he said. "What were you shooting before you came here?" She looked at him then. The full assessment. He held it without flinching. "Before I deployed," she said, "I was shooting precision bolt gun in competition. 950 meters. Personal best was 4 consecutive hits on a 12-inch plate at 800 meters under 15 miles per hour variable crosswind." The valley was spread out below them. The hawk had found something and dropped. "You need to tell Rourke that," he said. "I tried to tell Rourke that," she said. "He removed me from the weapons training rotation and told me to stay in my lane." Merritt opened his mouth and closed it. Because she could see him realizing nothing to say to that which would make a dent in what they were both looking at. They sat in silence for another minute. Then he said, "Why haven't you pushed harder?" Gone over his head. She looked at the valley. The haze was thickening in the way it thickened every afternoon at this hour, reducing visibility across the floor to the point where observation from the Firebase was significantly impaired. "My grandfather sat me down when I was about 12 years old," she said, "and I was upset because a boy at the range had told me girls couldn't shoot. He said, 'Nora, there are 2 ways to prove something to a person who doesn't believe it. You can argue with them until they give up disagreeing, which means they still don't believe it. They've just run out of energy to say so. Or you can wait for the moment when the truth becomes undeniable and let that moment do the work for you.' He said the second way is slower and it requires patience most people don't have. But it is the only way that actually changes what a person knows." Merritt was quiet. "So you're waiting," he said. "I'm always waiting," she said, "but I'm not waiting empty-handed." She stood and went back to the medical bay, and Jonah Merritt sat on the rock shelf and looked at the valley and thought about what it meant to be carrying something that no one around you could see. The movement on the far ridgeline had a pattern. She had noticed it first on day 29, which was now 12 days ago, which meant she had been watching it accumulate into certainty for nearly 2 weeks. The movement appeared consistently in a 3-hour window in the early afternoon, specifically during the period when the thermal haze was thickest and visibility across the valley floor was most impaired. It appeared always in the same general sector of the ridgeline, always positioned in relation to the same reference features, and always positioned to maximize the crossing angle on the main patrol route. She had spent 2 hours with her calculations in her notebooks on day 29 and had reached a conclusion she did not like. A skilled marksman at the tooth would have a clear shot at the valley funnel at approximately 840 meters. The wind at that distance at that time of day would require a specific holdover and adjustment that most shooters, even good ones, would not automatically apply because it ran counter to standard assumptions about wind behavior at that range. The thermal counter-rotation at elevation was the variable that most people missed. The counter-rotation was the thing she had been recording every morning and every evening for 29 days. She had taken this information to Sergeant Pruitt on the afternoon of day 29. Pruitt ran intelligence for the Firebase. He was a careful, methodical man who processed information with the professional neutrality of someone whose job required him to neither overweight nor underweight what he received. He had thanked her politely and entered the observation into the system. Supplemental observation, non-tactical source. She had not taken it to Rourke because she had already tried the official channel 3 weeks before that. She had asked to be added to the weapons training rotation. Rourke had looked at her qualification file, noted that it contained a basic pistol certification Navy standard, and had told her she was a medical asset and to stay in her lane. When she had said she still wanted to be added to the rotation, the silence that followed had been the kind of silence that functions as a door closing. She had not gone over his head because going over his head was not the kind of action that would produce the kind of outcome she needed. So she recorded, she mapped, she calculated. She labeled the section in her third notebook calculation, and she prepared for the moment when preparation would be the only thing standing between the people around her and the cost of their own certainty. On the evening of day 41, she sat in the medical bay after the compound had gone quiet, and she read what she had written about the tooth, about the angles, about the firing solution she had built from 41 mornings of wind data, about the specific correction required for a shooter at that elevation, accounting for the counter-rotation in the lower third of the trajectory. She read it once. She closed the notebook. She turned off the light. Through the small window above her desk, the far ridgeline was a dark mass against a sky full of stars, indifferent and absolute, and somewhere in the black bulk of that ridge, in the broken formation she had named for a fractured tooth, something was waiting. She thought about her grandfather's voice, the particular texture of it, unhurried, carrying the weight of a man who had looked at hard things long enough that hard things had stopped surprising him. "Are you ready?" he had asked her the last time they spoke. Not the skill, not the training. You. She had told him she thought so. He had said, "That's not what I asked." She lay down on her cot without undressing and looked at the ceiling of the medical bay and thought about the difference between being prepared and being ready, and about whether a person ever knew which one they were until the moment that required them to find out. Tomorrow was Thursday. Rourke had announced the patrol at evening brief. 8 men. Standard route. The route that passed through the valley funnel at its most exposed section. The stretch of open ground that sat at approximately 840 meters from the tooth. Declan Webb would carry the MK-11. Griffith Doyle would go despite the shoulder because Rourke had decided 4 to 6 days was a recommendation and not an order. Jonah Merritt would be on the team. She thought about the second notebook and the third notebook and the 41 days of information that had been collected and recorded and submitted through available channels and filed under non-tactical source. She thought about the firing solution she had built from 41 mornings of cold and wind and careful attention. She thought about what her grandfather had said about the moment when the truth becomes undeniable. She thought about what it cost. Outside, the wind came off the ridge the way it always did in the late hours, finding the gap in the rock formation, moving through the compound with the indifferent purpose of something that goes where the terrain directs it and does not consider what it passes through. She listened to it. She recorded it in her memory, direction and velocity, and the specific quality of the late-night thermal that told her what the morning would bring, because the discipline did not pause for darkness, did not pause for exhaustion, did not pause for the weight of what she was carrying into the next day. Only from doing it every single day until it was not a thing you did, but a thing you were. She closed her eyes. Tomorrow was Thursday. She would be ready. The patrol moved out at 7:15. Nora stood in the doorway of the medical bay and watched them gear up in the gray pre-dawn light, 8 men moving through the familiar choreography of departure with the practiced efficiency of people who have done this enough times that the ritual has become muscle memory. Weapons checks, radio checks, the small systematic confirmations that everything is what it needs to be before you walk out the gate and into the ground that does not care about you. Griffith Doyle rolled his shoulder once testing it, and she watched his jaw tighten at the response he got, and watched him make the decision. She had known he would make the decision that every man on this firebase made, every time his body told him something his pride did not want to hear. He adjusted the weight of his pack and moved into formation. Declan Webb had the MK-11 slung across his back. He was moving with the particular focused energy she had noticed in him over the past few days, the energy of someone whose instincts are telling them the environment has shifted in a direction they cannot yet name. He had good instincts. She had observed that about him in the same careful peripheral way she observed everything at Firebase Kestrel. Rourke was at the front. He did not look at her. Jonah Merritt was near the rear of the formation. He looked at her. Not long, not obviously, just the brief, directed attention of a person making an acknowledgement that could not be spoken. She held his gaze for exactly the time it took to confirm the acknowledgement was mutual. Then he turned and walked through the gate. She went back inside. She sat at her desk and opened the third notebook and read the morning's wind entry one more time. Northwest 7 miles per hour, light variable. The thermal pattern off the eastern face was running consistent with the preceding 6 days. The counter-rotation in the lower third of the trajectory would be present by mid-morning and would intensify through early afternoon. She had the firing solution memorized to a degree that went beyond conscious recall, the numbers living in her, the way the ridgeline lived in her, instantly available, not retrieved, but simply present. She closed the notebook. She placed it in the left breast pocket of her jacket where it sat alongside the trauma shears she carried every day in the same pocket for the same reason her grandfather had told her to always carry the tool you would need in the field on your body, and not in a bag you might have to leave somewhere. She waited. At 7:48, the first RPG hit the valley floor. She heard it as a compression in the air, a concussive thump that arrived faster than comprehension, followed immediately by the distinct crack of heavy machine gun fire, the sound of a weapon being operated by someone who knew what they were doing, controlled bursts, deliberate, not suppressive, targeted. She was already moving. She was moving before the first voice on the radio finished its first sentence because she had been waiting for 41 days, and she had known in the way that certain kinds of preparation settle into certainty that this was not a question of if, but of when, and when had arrived, and her body understood this before her mind had completed the thought. She crossed the compound at a run. Commander Hatch was coming out of the Tactical Operations Center when she reached it, moving fast, his face carrying the controlled urgency of a man translating chaos into command decisions in real time. "Callahan," he started. "What's the situation?" she said, not asking permission to know. Asking because she needed the information in the next 3 seconds. He looked at her, the look of a man recategorizing something very quickly. "Ambush, valley floor near the eastern funnel, machine gun position on the high ridge, Webb is down." She was already moving again. "Where is the MK-11? She said over her shoulder. "Callahan." She stopped, turned, looked at him with the full weight of 41 days of preparation and 41 days of being invisible. "I know exactly where the machine gun support position is," she said. "I know the range, I know the wind, I know the holdover required for a shot at that position at this time of day. I have it calculated and documented. Where is the MK-11? Hatch looked at her for 1 full second. On the radio behind him, Rourke's voice came through, stripped of everything except the essential. "Send the doc. Send the doc, and whoever can shoot, send them." Hatch stepped aside. The armory was 20 feet from the Tactical Operations Center, and Corporal Reeves had the cage open before she reached the door. She stopped in the doorway and looked at him. He was standing behind the cage with the MK-11 already lifted from its mount, already oriented toward her, and his face carried no surprise. None. The expression of a man who had been expecting this moment and had positioned himself accordingly. "Wind's been running northwest about 8, he said. "Dropping in the next few minutes. I've been watching it." She looked at him. "How long?" she said. 3 weeks, he said, "after I saw you doing it." She held his gaze for 1 moment. Something passed between them that did not require language, the recognition of one person by another across the gap of everything that had been preventing that recognition. Then she took the rifle. She ran the 4-second check that her hands knew how to run without instruction from her mind. Magazine, chamber, scope settings, bipod. The small systematic confirmation that the tool is what it needs to be. Reeves watched her do it and said nothing more because nothing more was required. She went out the door and through the gate at a run. The valley sounded different from inside the firefight than it did from the firebase. She had known this intellectually, but knowing it intellectually and running toward it were not the same experience. The machine gun was working in the controlled, deliberate bursts she had heard from the compound, but from here, moving through the approach with the valley opening out ahead of her, the sound had a different quality. immediate, physical. The quality of a sound that is not a report of something happening somewhere else, but the central fact of where you are. She did not run toward the obvious high ground. She ran toward the specific position she had identified from 41 mornings of observation. Not the nearest elevation, not the position most people would select, but the one place on this side of the valley that gave a clear angle over the rock formation at the base of the approach, while maintaining an exposed line to the tooth across 840 meters of mountain air. She had never fired from this position. She had only imagined it. Her grandfather's voice present in her, the way it was always present. You plan from the ground, you adjust from the position. The planning is never wasted, but the position will always tell you something you didn't know. She got there. She went prone. The MK-11 settled into her shoulder with the deliberate precision of a person connecting to something they have used long enough that the connection is not mechanical but organic. Her cheek found the stock. Her right eye found the scope. 840 meters of morning air materialized in the glass, the far ridgeline sharp and immediate and traversable in a way it had never been from the medical bay doorway. She found the machine gun crew the way her grandfather had taught her to find targets. Not by looking for the obvious, not by hunting for movement, by following the geometry of the weapon system itself, finding where the shooter had to be in order to be doing what the weapon was doing and working backward from the weapon to the person. The angle of the incoming fire told her the elevation. The pattern of the burst told her the axis of the position. The geometry told her the location before she had consciously processed any individual piece of information. She adjusted for the wind. 7 miles per hour northwest dropping. She built in the elevation correction for 840 meters. She added the specific holdover for the barrel depression at this shooting position that she had calculated and never verified, but that the geometry of the location confirmed was within acceptable parameters. She took a breath in, let half of it out, found the still point between heartbeats. She pressed the trigger. Below in the valley, the machine gun stopped, not suppressed, not interrupted, stopped. In the particular absolute way that a weapon stops when the person operating it is no longer capable of operating it. One moment it was the central defining fact of the firefight, and the next moment it was nothing, an absence where a sound had been, and the absence was so complete and so sudden that every man on that valley floor felt it in the body before they registered it in the mind. Jonah Merritt heard the shot from the Firebase side of the valley, and in the specific mode of someone actively trying not to die, he did not immediately understand what it meant. Then the machine gun stopped, and he understood. That was the doc, he said. He said it softly. He said it before he had consciously decided to say it, the words arriving from a place below decision from the part of him that had been watching Nora Callahan for 5 weeks and filing information about what he saw and reaching conclusions that no one around him had been interested in reaching. 4 seconds. The second shot crossed the valley and found the second member of the machine gun crew, and the gun did not come back up. And the answer to every unasked question about what the doc was capable of announced itself with the kind of clarity that does not require words. The firefight changed. The enemy fighters who had been advancing under the cover of the machine gun fire hesitated. The small arms became reactive instead of offensive. The fire of people who have lost their support element and are trying to understand what changed and where the new threat is coming from. Merritt used the hesitation. "Move," he said, and pulled Cross by the collar toward the nearest rock outcropping. "Get Strand. Get Webb." Cross was already moving toward the fallen shooter, moving in the low, scrambling run of a man who knows that the window between one threat going quiet and the next one opening up is measured in heartbeats. Webb was conscious. That was the best thing anyone could say about Webb in this moment. He was conscious, and he was breathing, and there was a wound across his upper chest that looked worse than it probably was, and his hands were still wrapped around the MK-11 because that was the kind of man he was, and Merritt filed that away to tell him later. Victor Strand was behind a shallow rock shelf, one hand pressed to his left thigh, his face carrying the expression of a man who is in significant pain and is choosing with concentrated effort to be somewhere other than inside it. "I'm here," Strand said. "I'm functional." "You're not functional," Merritt said, reaching him. He pulled Strand's hand away from the wound long enough to assess it and pressed it back. "Through and through, lateral thigh. You need Callahan's hands on you in the next 30 minutes. Then the shot came from across the valley, not from Nora's direction. From the far ridge. A single precision shot from a position in the high rocks that no one had specifically located or identified, a position that the intelligence brief had categorized as possible reconnaissance and low priority. The enemy sniper. The round hit the rock 4 inches from Merritt's left shoulder, and he was flat on the ground before the sound fully registered. The body making the decision. The mind was still processing, pressing itself into the earth with the urgency of something that has just been reminded of its own vulnerability. He heard Rourke on the radio. "Contact sniper, far ridge, everybody down." Then Rourke's voice cut off. "Not radio failure." Merritt found him 40 feet to the right behind a boulder, left arm hanging at an angle that communicated the story without requiring narration. Not arterial. Rourke's color was still reasonable, but the bone was compromised and the arm was useless, and the man who had been running this firefight was now operating at significantly reduced capacity. "The sniper has coverage on the entire valley floor," Rourke said. "We can't move, we can't advance, Webb is down, I can't with one arm." He stopped. Something moved across his face that Merritt had never seen there before in 17 months of working under this man in every difficult environment and every hard decision. Something that in another context might have been called humility. "Where is Callahan?" Rourke said. "Right now." "Still on the high position above the gate," Merritt said. She took out the machine gun. Both crew members. Clean shots at 840 meters. Rourke was quiet for 2 full seconds, looking at the ground. In those 2 seconds, Merritt watched a man recalibrate something fundamental about his understanding of the world he thought he knew. Then Rourke picked up the radio. "Callahan," he said, "this is Rourke. I need you to find the sniper position on the far ridge, northeast quadrant, high rocks. Can you see it?" The pause before she answered was not hesitation. Merritt knew that now. The pause was the silence of a person who was already looking, already processing, using the pause, not because she didn't know, but because she was confirming what she knew before she committed to speaking it. "I see 2 candidate positions," she said. Her voice on the radio was exactly as it was in person. Even. Precise. Carrying no weight it did not need to carry. "I've been tracking movement in the northeast rock formation for 12 days. I have calculations for both positions. The primary is what I've been calling the tooth of broken rock formation at approximately 840 meters, elevated about 60 feet above the ridge floor. The secondary is approximately 30 meters west." The radio was silent for a moment. Then Rourke said, "You've been tracking this for 12 days. "Yes." He did not say, "And you didn't tell me." He did not say, "Why didn't you come to me?" He was a man who had spent 17 years in the teams, and he understood in this moment with a clarity that was neither comfortable nor avoidable that the answer to both of those questions was sitting in the record of every interaction he had conducted with Nora Callahan since she arrived at Firebase Kestrel, and that the record did not reflect well on him. "What do you need?" he said. "Wind correction," she said. "I need someone on the valley floor calling me real-time adjustments. The wind is doing something unusual. It's running south along the valley bottom, but the thermal off the ridge is creating a counter-rotation at elevation that I can't fully compensate for without a second set of eyes on the trace." Merritt was already on the radio before Rourke could respond. "Callahan, this is Merritt. I'll give you wind." "What are you reading right now?" "I'm seeing left to right push at my level approximately 7 to 8 miles per hour," she said. "But the trace on my last 2 shots is drifting high right at the terminal end, which means there's an elevation layer pushing the opposite direction somewhere in the lower third of the trajectory." Merritt looked at the valley. He was looking for the visual tells, dust and debris, and the way loose material moved along the ground. He had done this before in training, calling wind for precision shooters, and he understood that calling wind for someone at 840 meters meant reading the entire column of air between the shooter and the target and giving them a picture of something that was fundamentally invisible. "I'm seeing right to left surface wind at the valley floor," he said. "Stronger than what you're reading. 10, maybe 11 miles per hour down here." "That explains the high right trace," she said. "The counter rotation is in the lower third, not the middle. That changes the correction." A pause of 3 seconds. "Merritt, if the sniper is at the tooth, he's elevated 60 feet above the ridge floor. The wind at his level will be closer to my level than to the valley floor. He's probably not accounting for the counter-rotation either." Merritt understood immediately. "So his next shot will pull high, right of whatever he's aiming at," he said. "Yes, by approximately 18 to 22 inches at this distance." Rourke was looking at him. His left arm was in an improvised sling, his face tight with managed effort, and he was listening to the exchange on the radio with the expression of a man hearing something he did not know existed and integrating it in real time. "We need to draw a shot," Merritt said. "Give her the muzzle flash." Rourke looked at his useless arm. He looked at Merritt. What kind of exposure? Controlled. Helmet on a rifle. Something that draws a shot without risking a life. She locates the flash and takes the shot. Rourke looked at the radio. Then he raised it. Callahan, he said, "We're going to draw a shot. When he fires, I need you on that muzzle flash. You get one chance at this." Her voice came back steady and immediate. "Understood. Tell Merritt to keep calling wind. I'm not going to adjust after the draw. I'm building the correction now. I need his data before the shot, not after." Merritt was already talking. "Valley floor wind holding right to left, I'd call it 9.5 now. Surface feels like it's settling slightly." "Copy," she said. "Building that in. Tell me when you're ready." Across the firefight, Cross had understood what was needed without being told. He had Doyle's helmet on the end of a rifle, was positioned behind a rock with the helmet barely visible above the edge, waiting. "Ready," Rourke said. The helmet came up. The shot from the far ridge came within 2 seconds. Fast and confident from a shooter who had been waiting for exactly this kind of exposure, whose discipline, considerable as it was, had a limit when a target presented itself. The shot went high right of the helmet by approximately 20 inches. In the same instant, from the high position above Firebase Kestrel, a single shot crossed 840 meters of mountain air. The far ridge went silent, not gradually, not in stages, all at once, in the way that a sound source goes silent when the thing producing the sound no longer exists. For a moment, nobody moved. The firefight held its breath. Then the radio crackled and Nora's voice came through, and what she said erased everything else immediately. "I'm hit," she said. "RPG airburst. Fragmentation right side. I'm functional. Someone needs to know my position. I'm not coming off the gun." Every man on that valley floor heard those words. Every man heard what came after them. Not fear, not shock, not the desperate sound of someone who needed to be saved. A status report. A clear-eyed assessment from a person who had evaluated the wound, made a decision about what mattered more than the wound, and was communicating the result of that decision in precise operational language. "I have 2 more enemy elements in movement to the northeast," she said. "They're trying to consolidate. I may have shots." Rourke said nothing for a moment. His face did something complicated and private that Merritt would spend a long time afterward trying to find the right word for. Then he said, "What's your status? Be specific." "Fragmentation right side lower rib cage. Not arterial. Breathing is functional. Hands are on the gun. I have the position." Merritt was already moving toward the firebase, toward the position above the gate, because someone needed to reach her, and he was the fastest. And because there was a part of him that had understood something about Nora Callahan from the first week he spent watching her, that told him she would stay on that rifle until she physically could not, and when she finally came off it, she was going to need someone who actually understood what she had done. He was halfway up the approach when her voice came through the radio one more time. "Merritt," she said. "Moving to your position," he said. 2 minutes. "I have eyes on a third element. 6 fighters on the northeast slope. They're going to try to flank the valley approach. I can take them, but I need you on wind right now." He stopped where he was. He looked at the valley. He looked at the full column of air between the high position above the firebase and the northeast slope, and he started calling wind. She started shooting. 3 shots. 3 separate adjustments. Each one called by Merritt. Each one fed into the calculation she had been building for 41 days in notebooks that no one had looked at. 3 shots that each time she fired sent a spike of pain through her injured side that she did not mention, did not allow into her voice, did not permit to enter the steady geometry of what her hands were doing. After the 3rd shot, the northeast slope went quiet. The remaining enemy fighters, stripped of their machine gun crew and their sniper and the coordinated structure that had made the ambush effective, began to scatter. The fire coming at the team became ragged and disorganized. The architecture of the attack was collapsing. Merritt resumed moving toward Nora's position. He covered the last 100 meters at a run and found her exactly where she had said she was, prone behind the rock shelf she had selected from 41 days of observation. The MK-11 still in her shoulder, her eyes still on the scope. Her right side was wet. The fragmentation had torn through her jacket, and she had applied a field dressing to herself one-handed without coming off the gun. He reached her and dropped beside her. "Is the northeast slope clear?" she said. He looked. He looked at everything his trained eyes could see and process. "Clear," he said. She let out a breath. Not a performance of relief. Just the exhale of a person who has been holding something very large and very heavy and has finally confirmed that it can be set down. She came off the rifle. She sat up. Her face was pale with blood loss and tight with the managed effort of someone who has been running on something beyond ordinary physical resource. But her eyes were completely clear-focused in the way that eyes are focused when the person behind them has been doing something that required their absolute attention and has not yet fully released from that state. She looked at him with an expression that was not triumph, and was not relief, and was not the face of someone who needed to be told they had done something remarkable. It was the face of someone who had simply done what they came to do. "How's Strand?" she said. "Left thigh through and through," Merritt said. "He needs you." She nodded and started to rise, and he put a hand on her arm. "You're wounded," he said. "I know," she said. "Strand is more wounded. Help me up." He helped her up. She took 3 seconds to run the internal accounting of a person assessing what their body could and could not do. Then she picked up the trauma kit she had set beside the firing position before she got on the gun, and she started moving toward the valley. She had never stopped being the medic. She had just also been everything else at the same time. Behind them on the far ridgeline, the tooth stood silent in the mountain air, the position that had been identified in a notebook no one had read and calculated by a woman, no one had thought worth calculating and neutralized by a single shot, that accounted for variables the enemy sniper had not known were variables. Merritt walked beside her and found that he had nothing to say that was not completely inadequate. So he said nothing. He walked beside her, and when she favored her right side too much, he moved closer without a word, and she used his shoulder once on a steep section of the approach briefly, and then steadied herself and walked on her own. The radio crackled. Rourke's voice. "Callahan," he said. He stopped. The pause stretched long enough that Merritt thought the transmission had cut out. It hadn't. Rourke was still there. He was just for the first time in the 17 years that any of these men had known him without the words for what came next. "Get to Strand," he said finally. "He's been asking for you." It was not an apology. It was not close to everything that needed to be said. But for Dale Rourke in that moment, it was the beginning of something. Callahan keyed her radio. "Copy that," she said. "I'm on my way." She reached Strand in 11 minutes. 11 minutes from the firing position above the gate, down through the approach across the valley floor where the silence of ended combat had settled like something physical heavier than the silence before it waited with everything that had just happened and everything that had not yet been processed. 11 minutes with fragmentation in her right side and Jonah Merritt 1 step behind her the entire way. Strand was exactly where Merritt had left him, flat behind the rock shelf, one hand pressed to his thigh. His face carried the gray undertone of significant blood loss managed through sheer refusal to acknowledge it. He was conscious, and he was talking when she reached him, a low, continuous stream that was approximately half tactical updates and half the kind of language that men use when they are in serious pain and have no other outlet for it. He stopped talking when he saw her, not because he was surprised to see her, because of what she looked like. "Doc," he said, and his voice dropped all the performance entirely, the managed toughness gone in an instant, replaced by something genuine and concerned. "You're hit." "So are you?" she said, dropping beside him, already moving his hand away from the wound, already running the assessment with fingers that knew exactly what they were looking for. "Mine can wait. Yours can't." "That's not how this works," Strand said. "Strand." She said his name with the quiet authority of someone who does not need volume to communicate that the conversation has ended. "Tell me when this started bleeding through the dressing." He closed his mouth. Then he said, "About 4 minutes ago." "Before that, was it slowing or steady?" "Slowed, then picked back up when I shifted position to get eyes on the northwest approach." She nodded. She had his pant leg cut open with the trauma shears from her left breast pocket, the tool she carried on her body every day because her grandfather had told her at 19 years old that the tool you need in an emergency is the tool already in your hand. She assessed the wound with the focused economy of someone who has done this enough times that the emotional weight of it runs alongside the technical process without interfering with it. Through and through. The round had entered the lateral thigh and exited cleanly, missing the femoral artery by a margin that was either exceptional luck or the universe acknowledging a debt. The bleeding was venous, serious, cumulative. The 4 minutes of increased flow told her the original field dressing had shifted and lost compression. She repacked the wound. Strand's jaw locked. He made a sound low in his throat that was not quite a word. His hands pressed flat against the rock on either side of him, tendons standing out along the backs of them. "I know," she said quietly. "Stay with me." "I'm with you," he said through his teeth. "Yeah, I'm with you." She applied the pressure dressing with both hands leaning into it, and the motion sent a spike through her own right side that she registered and filed and did not allow to reach her hands. Her grandfather had spent 30 years making them reliable for exactly this reason. "This holds until the helo," she said. "You hear me, this holds." "Copy," Strand said. His breathing was beginning to even out the specific physiological response to competent hands and a voice that communicated certainty without performance. Her grandfather had told her at 19 that the first thing you treat is their confidence that they're going to survive. Everything else is secondary. She finished securing the dressing. Checked his pulse, checked his eyes. 2 minutes, she said. Then we move you. I can walk, Strand said. You can move with assistance, she said. That's different from walking. Don't argue with me about the distinction. He almost smiled. It came close to the surface and then receded into the pain, but it had been there. Dale Rourke appeared around the rock shelf from the direction of the valley floor. He came without announcement, his left arm in an improvised sling made from a length of gear, webbing his face carrying the managed compression of a man, redirecting a significant portion of his available energy away from pain and toward function. His eyes moved from Strand to Nora to Merritt and back to Nora, running the inventory of damage with the systematic attention of a man who is responsible for what he sees. He stopped when he reached them. He looked at Nora's right side. The blood-soaked jacket. The field dressing visible at the bottom edge of it. The fact that she was kneeling on rocky ground performing a medical procedure on someone else while carrying a fragmentation wound that most people would be lying down with. How long for the helo, she said. She did not look up from her final check on Strand's dressing. 45 minutes minimum, Rourke said. Webb needs attention before 45 minutes. Webb's been field dressed by Cross. Cross is excellent at many things, she said. She looked up at Rourke for the first time. Emergency medicine is not one of them. I need to get to Webb in the next 10 minutes. Can you take Strand? The question landed in a particular way. Not a challenge. A genuine operational question from one person to another about whether a task could be accomplished. But it carried everything that surrounded it because of the arm, because of 41 days, because of what had just happened on the ridge above them. Rourke looked at his left arm. He looked at Strand. He looked back at her. Merritt takes Strand, he said. I'm with you to Webb. She held his gaze for 1 second. Then she nodded and stood, and Rourke watched her stand and saw what it cost her and said nothing about it because she had not asked him to say anything about it. They moved. Merritt got Strand upright, and they began the careful, slow progress toward the firebase. Nora moved ahead with Rourke cutting left toward the position where Cross had gotten Webb behind cover. Rourke stayed 1 step behind her and slightly to her left in the position of a person who is prepared to catch someone without calling attention to being prepared to catch them. She noticed. She said nothing. Webb was conscious, and that remained the best thing that could be said about him. Cross had gotten the field dressing on correctly, and the bleeding had been managed adequately for this window of time. She assessed the chest wound with the rapid, systematic focus of someone working in field conditions without the resources she needed, looking for the things she could evaluate. Respiratory pattern, tracheal position, the signs of tension, pneumothorax. What she found was that Declan Webb was extremely lucky. Breathe for me, she said, slow and even. Webb breathed. She listened. She placed her hand on his chest and felt the expansion. You have a partial thickness wound on the upper right chest wall, she said. It looks worse than it is. You are going to be on a helo in 45 minutes and in a surgical suite within 3 hours, and you are going to be fine. You sure? Webb said. His voice was thin but present. I'm sure, she said. And she was. The certainty was not performance. It was the earned confidence of someone who has looked at enough wounded people to know the difference between serious and fatal. Webb closed his eyes briefly. Open them. Doc, he said. Cross told me it was you who took out the machine gun. Don't talk about that right now, she said. Focus on breathing. I just want to say, Webb. She said his name gently but with the same quiet finality she used for everything, slow and even. That's your only job right now. He closed his mouth. He breathed. She was reaching across her own body for the secondary dressing she wanted to add to Cross's work when the motion pulled at her right side and she stopped for half a second. Just half a second. Rourke saw it. He was standing 3 feet behind her, and he saw the pause and the way her jaw tightened and the way she immediately continued the motion as though the pause had not happened. Callahan, he said quietly. Let me look at that when you're done with Webb. I need to finish this dressing. After that, I need to check on Doyle's shoulder. He's been carrying underload, and I told him 4 to 6 days. Callahan. His voice was different now. Something in it that had not been there before in 41 days of interactions in this firebase, something that was not an order and was not dismissal. Let me look at it after Webb, please. The word please landed in the air between them like a stone dropped in still water. Merritt, who had returned from getting Strand situated and was standing 10 feet away, heard it and went very still. Cross, who was on perimeter and should not have been listening, was listening. Nora finished Webb's dressing. She ran her final check. Then she sat back and turned to face Rourke. He looked at her right side the way a person looks at something they are responsible for, not medically but in the deeper sense, the sense of consequence. "I'm going to need you to hold this end," she said, and she held out the end of a wrap bandage. "If you can manage that arm." "I can manage it for that," he said. He reached out with his right hand and took the end of the bandage and held it while she worked. They were in physical proximity for the first time in 41 days without the architecture of rank and dismissal between them, and the absence of that architecture was its own kind of enormous. She worked. He held. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Rourke said, "How long have you known about the sniper position?" 12 days, she said. "I reported it to Pruitt on day 29. He entered it as a supplemental observation from a non-tactical source." The silence that followed had texture. "You should have come to me," Rourke said. She looked up at him. Her expression was not anger. It was something more complicated and more honest than anger, the face of a person deciding how much truth to put in a sentence and deciding to put all of it. "I did come to you," she said. 3 weeks ago I asked to be added to the weapons training rotation. You told me to stay in my lane." Rourke was quiet. "I had the firing solution for the tooth calculated 12 days ago." She continued, her voice even, and without accusation, simply factual in the way that undeniable things are factual. "I had it written down. If anyone had asked, I could have given them a complete solution before this morning. I tried to find a way to make that information useful. I was not given a channel to make it useful." "So you waited," Rourke said. "I prepared," she said. "And I waited for the moment when what I'd prepared became something no one could ignore." He held her gaze. Something moved across his face that was probably the most expensive thing Dale Rourke had produced in his 43 years, the expression of a person who is understanding in real time the full weight of a mistake that cannot be undone. "Strand could have died," he said quietly. "Webb could have died. Any of us." "Yes," she said, "because the information existed and the channel was closed. That's the full accounting, Senior Chief. That's what happened." He looked at her for a long moment. She went back to the dressing, working around his grip on the bandage end. "I was wrong," Rourke said. 3 words. Simple. Undecorated. The most stripped-down version of an admission a man like Dale Rourke was capable of producing, and because of that, the truest. "I was wrong about you. About what you are. About what you are capable of. I made a decision based on a category instead of a person, and that decision had real consequences." Nora tied off the bandage. She took a breath, then another. "I know," she said. "It was not forgiveness. It was not absolution. It was simply acknowledgement, a confirmation that what he had said was accurate, that it matched the record, nothing more and nothing less." From 10 feet away, Merritt stood very still and felt something he did not have a name for. Not satisfaction, not vindication exactly, something older and more complicated. The feeling of watching a truth become visible after a long time in the dark. The helo arrived 38 minutes later. The loading was controlled urgency, organized by training. Webb on a litter cross and 2 others moving with the careful speed of people who understand that careful and fast are not opposites. Strand walking under his own power to a degree that surprised everyone, and then surprised no one who had spent more than a week around Victor Strand. Strand saw her coming and stopped. He looked at her side, at the wrapped jacket, at the sutured arm visible below her rolled sleeve, where she had already begun the work on herself between treating him and treating Webb. "Doc," he said. His voice dropped the operational register entirely. "You look terrible." "You look worse," she said. "Keep moving." "Am I cleared for the helo?" "Yes." "You're sure?" "Strand," she said. "I am sure." He almost smiled again, and this time it arrived brief and genuine. He reached out and put his hand on her shoulder, his right hand steady and deliberate. He looked at her and ran out of the specific language the moment required, but he did not seem to need to find it. What he did instead was pull her toward him carefully, mindful of her right side, and hold on for exactly the right amount of time. She stood with that for a moment. "Go," she said quietly. "Get on the helo." He went. Webb reached out from the litter and squeezed her hand as they carried him past. She squeezed back. That was the whole of it, clean and sufficient. The helo lifted. The sound of it diminished into the mountain air. Firebase Kestrel exhaled. Commander Hatch called the team together 40 minutes after the helo departed. Not a formal brief. There was not the structure for a formal brief in the immediate aftermath of a firefight with wounded still on their way to surgical care. It was more like what happens when the immediate emergency is over and the people involved need to be in the same place at the same time, accounting for what occurred even if the accounting is incomplete and still being assembled. They stood in the common area. Rourke with his arm in a proper sling now. Cross, Doyle, Merritt, Pruitt, Reeves, whom Hatch had included by explicit invitation, and Nora. 8 people. The people who remained. Hatch looked at each of them in turn. "We are all going to write complete reports," he said. "Full accounts. Timeline decisions, actions, outcomes. Honest. And when I say honest, I mean the kind of honest that includes what information existed on this Firebase, where it was, what was done with it, and what wasn't." He looked at Nora directly, not accusatory, not performative, the direct look of a commander acknowledging a person in front of witnesses. That part of the account matters. For this team and for the next team that comes through here, we are going to get it right. He paused. "Callahan," he said, "I owe you an operational apology. Your assessment of the enemy sniper position was correct, documented, and submitted through available channels before this engagement. The channel failed. That failure contributed to this morning's casualties. I am putting that in my report in those words." Pruitt nodded without being prompted. Hatch looked at Rourke. Rourke stepped forward. Or not forward exactly. He was already in the room, but something in him shifted, a straightening that was not physical posture, but something deeper and more structural. He looked at Nora, and he did not look away. "I have been doing this for 17 years, he said. His voice was controlled, but stripped of the authority performance that usually lived in it. What was left underneath was simpler and heavier. "In 17 years, I have made decisions about people based on what I thought I could see. I thought I was good at seeing." He stopped, looked at the floor briefly, then back at her. "I made a decision about you based on a category instead of a person. I decided what you were before I looked at what you are. That decision had consequences. Real ones. Men I am responsible for could have died because of it." The common area was absolutely silent. "Webb almost did," he said. "Strand almost did. I almost did." Another pause longer. "I was wrong. I am telling you that in front of this team with full understanding of what it means and what it doesn't fix. I am telling you because you are owed it, and because these men are owed it, and because the truth of what happened today should not be something anyone has to wonder about." He looked at Cross then. Cross held his gaze, and for the first time in all the months Merritt had known him, Harlan Cross looked genuinely uncomfortable in his own skin in a way that was not performance. "I failed," Rourke said. "Not the enemy. The enemy did what enemies do. I failed because I closed a door that should have been open, and people I am responsible for paid for it." He stopped. He did not look for a reaction. He had said what needed to be said, and he was letting it exist in the room without managing what it did there. Nora looked at him for a long moment. Something in her posture shifted. Not warmth exactly, not forgiveness in the full and immediate sense of that word, but the specific acknowledgement of a person who has heard something true and is registering it as true. It was Cross who broke the silence. The fact that it was Cross was the thing Merritt would remember longest about that moment. "I've got something to say too," Cross said. His voice was not his usual voice. His usual voice was big and easy and took up as much space as it wanted. This voice was smaller and working harder. "The stuff in the common room. The stuff I said every morning." He exhaled. "That wasn't just disrespect. I was making it harder for her to function in a place where what she is matters. I did it because I could. Because no one stopped me." He looked at Nora directly. "I'm sorry, Callahan, not because of this morning, because of every morning before it." Nora looked at him. She held his gaze long enough that the silence had its own presence. "I accept that," she said. 3 words, direct and complete. Not more than was needed, not less. Cross nodded once and looked at the floor. And that was the full extent of what he could manage, and it was enough. "All right," Hatch said quietly. "We have a Firebase to secure and reports to write." They dispersed. Merritt stayed. Nora stayed. And Rourke stayed, which surprised Merritt, the 3 of them standing in the common area after everyone else had gone, the wind audible against the outer walls in the quiet. Rourke reached into his jacket. He produced a folded piece of paper and held it out to her. She took it, unfolded it. It was the weapons qualification request she had submitted 3 weeks ago, the one he had returned with a note about staying in her lane. Across it in Rourke's handwriting were 4 words. "Approved. Priority expedite." She looked at it. She looked at him. "That's retroactive," Rourke said. "It doesn't undo anything, but it goes in your file with the original submission date." He paused. "I also spoke to Hatch before the brief. There's going to be a formal recommendation. Long-range marksmanship instructor position. Fort Bragg. They're rebuilding the qualification pipeline for attached personnel in high-threat environments. They need someone who can teach the physical discipline while also understanding the operational context. He looked at her steadily. They asked for you, by name, from 2 levels above hatch. Nora folded the paper carefully along the original fold lines. She put it in her jacket pocket. Thank you, she said. Simple, direct, no ornamentation. Rourke nodded. He started to leave. Then he stopped the way he always stopped when there was one more thing. Your grandfather, he said. What did he do after the Corps? She looked at him, mildly surprised by the question. He went back to Arizona, she said. He had land outside Tucson. He built a range on it. He spent 30 years out there shooting and teaching people who wanted to learn. He used to say the discipline is its own purpose, that you don't maintain the skill for a moment. You maintain it because the person who maintains it is a different kind of person than the person who doesn't. Rourke absorbed this. He looked at the floor. He looked up. He raised you right, he said. He left. Merritt looked at Nora. She was looking at the pocket where she had placed the paper, and her expression held the weight of the acknowledgement and the insufficiency of it, and the reality that it was also genuine, and the complicated way all of those things coexisted without canceling each other out. You okay? He said. And this time he meant it without the operational filter, fully in the way that one person means it when they are asking another person and actually want to know. She thought about it. She gave it the same honest consideration she gave wind data and trajectory calculations. I keep thinking about the moment before the first shot, she said, when I was looking through the scope at 840 meters, and I had the correction built and I was at the still point before the trigger press. In that moment, everything was just true. The wind was what it was, the distance was what it was, the correction was what it was, and my job was to not lie about any of it, not even a little. Because at 840 meters, even a small lie in your correction kills a shot. She paused. I keep thinking about how much of what happened before today was people lying to themselves. Not big lies, small ones. The lie that says a category tells you the truth about a person. The lie that says your assumption about someone is the same as your experience of them. Those are small lies and they have consequences like bullets. Merritt was quiet for a moment. Your grandfather teach you that too, he said. No, she said, that one I figured out here. Over 41 days. She started toward the medical bay, moving more carefully than she had before the brief. The adrenaline that had been carrying her now metabolized what was underneath, making itself known in clear and specific terms. She walked anyway. Callahan, Merritt said. She stopped. For what it's worth, he said, and he said it in the flat, honest register of someone who means a thing and wants the meaning to land without decoration. The moment the machine gun stopped, I knew it was you before I said it on the radio. I knew because of the way it stopped. It didn't sputter. It didn't get suppressed. It just stopped. Clean. One shot and then one more and then silence. That's not luck. That's not training alone either. That's something a person builds over years and protects and carries and uses exactly when it matters. He paused. You built that. You carried it here. And you used it when the rest of us couldn't. She turned and looked at him, and what crossed her face in that moment was something unguarded and genuine and a little raw around the edges, the way things are when they have been held in a private place for a long time and are finally encountering air. Thank you, Merritt, she said. Jonah, he said. At this point, I think you can call me Jonah. Something that was unmistakably a smile found its way to her face. Brief, but real. The kind of smile that is not performed for anyone else's benefit, but simply exists because something true has been exchanged between two people. Thank you, Jonah, she said. She went into the medical bay and sat down on the exam table and reached for her trauma kit. She sutured the wound on her arm with her left hand, 8 careful stitches placed with the precision of someone who has been doing this long enough that the hand knows what to do even when the angle is awkward. She wrapped her ribs. She took 2 ibuprofen because it was what was available. Then she opened the 3rd notebook. She opened it to the morning wind, reading she had recorded in the pre-dawn dark, and she looked at the numbers and she picked up her pen. She wrote the date, day 42. 8 rounds fired, 840 meters, 5 targets neutralized, wind held as predicted. Arden was right. She looked at what she had written for a moment. Then she wrote one more line below it. 30 years from now, some young woman in some hard place will not have to wait 41 days. That is the work. That is the whole of the work. She closed the notebook. She turned off the light. Outside, the wind came off the ridge the way it always did in the late afternoon, directional and measurable, moving through the empty space where a machine gun had been, and through the silence on the high rocks where an enemy sniper had believed himself to be invisible. It moved past both of those places without pausing because the wind does not pause for what is no longer there. It just moves. It just continues. It asks only one question of the things it encounters. Can you read me when it matters? Nora Callahan could. She always could. And now finally the men around her knew it too.